Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. My name's Joan Hoey. I'm the editor of the Economist Annual Democracy Index and a consultant for the Europe team at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Welcome to this 5th annual Romanian Business and Investment Summit. It's a great pleasure for the Economist Impact to be back in town and to hold this important event at a very momentous time in global geopolitics, as well as in Romanian domestic politics, I guess, as well. The focus of this event is very much on the economy, the business and investment outlook, and we'll be focusing on key sectors such as telecoms and tech, energy, banking and finance, and other key industries. And I thought it might be a good idea to start with our own global outlook, just to give a few pointers maybe, or food for thought ahead of our discussions today. So I'm just going to take you through a few slides. And that's going to cover a bit about geopolitics, a bit about national politics, and the economic outlook, of course. So let's get started. So geopolitics, what we're seeing and what we have been seeing for some time now is an intensification, I would say, of great power competition. This is not something new. It's been there for a long time, but it's obviously come to the fore quite prominently in recent years. And we have a new president in the White House pursuing an America First agenda. And what does that mean? What does it mean for America, and what does it mean for American foreign policy, and therefore for America's traditional allies and its foes as well? I would say that Donald Trump is a man on a mission, and his mission is mainly on the home front. It's primarily a domestic mission as he and his team sees it, to essentially try and restore some accountability between government and voters and the population. And to that end, I think that DOGE is front and center of what Donald Trump is trying to do, and this war on DEI and woke and globalism and so on and so forth. And I think as far as Team Trump understand what they're trying to do is very much that they see that American institutions are no longer fit for purpose, that they are politically, morally, operationally not really serving the American people, and that's his primary mission. So he sees his focus as restoring America at home, first of all, and I think that has implications for the foreign policy that he is pursuing. I think what that means primarily is that he wants to rid America of foreign entanglements that might demand more US intervention. So he wants to end the war in Ukraine because he doesn't want to have to deal with an even bigger crisis at some point, maybe a collapse, a Ukrainian collapse, maybe a Russian overreach, maybe a miscalculation or an accident that demands that the US pour in more resources, both financial resources, but also in terms of policy focus as well. So he wants to end this war in Ukraine. He's essentially looking for stability in other regions of the world, whether it's in this region, in the Balkans, in the Eastern Balkans, Western Balkans, and also in the Middle East. So I think it's the domestic agenda that is primarily the driver of his foreign policy, and everything is subordinate to that. And it means at home that he's pursuing so there's essentially a return of the Monroe Doctrine about extending America's influence and control in its own backyard. And we've seen in the first 50 days or so of this kind of Trump team shock therapy, if we want to call it that, what that means for countries in the immediate vicinity. So that's the direction of Trump's domestic and foreign policy. So, what does that mean for the rest of the world? We've entered a multipolar, much more multipolar world. I think, what we're seeing is a kind of overreaction in a way to the arrival of Donald Trump, because it seems from the discussion that everybody's assuming that a very decisive change has occurred in the past few weeks. But the truth is that the sort of geopolitical shifts that are taking place have been taking place over many years. And whatever new world order is now emerging will not be a complete break with the past. There's always going to be elements of continuity. So there's a lot of discussion these days about the end of the West. I'm hearing that everywhere at Chatham House in the UK, other foreign policy experts talking about the end of the West in terms of the end of this global alliance of liberal democracies. And we're also hearing a lot again about the end of globalization. And I think all these things are really overblown as a reaction, and it'll be good maybe to discuss some of that today, because if we think about what has really changed, I think the decisive change took place quite some time ago, and it took place after the end of the Cold War back in 1990. That was the big change. And then we had this brief kind of unipolar moment of US dominance. And that's what's really come to an end as a result of the US's waning economic power, the shifting balance, global economic balance towards the East, and the rise of other powers. So the US is still the preeminent global power in terms of its military capacity, in terms of its economy. Maybe it's still first, but measured in some terms, it's already in second place. So the US is still there as a preeminent power, but it's now alongside others, and not just China, obviously many other kind of middle powers as well. We have India, we have Iran, we have Saudi, we have Turkey, and so on and so forth. And globalization, the end of globalization has been talked about so often over the years. And obviously we are heading for a more fragmented global economy, a more troubled global economy. We've seen the rise of protectionism, not just over the past 50 days, but actually since the Obama era, actually, that's been happening. But the death of globalization, I think, is exaggerated. There's no collapse in global trade or global investment, and it's unlikely that there will be, because cross-border trade and investment is so embedded. Those structures take a long time and relationships take a long time to put in place. So they're not going to change overnight. It's going to take a very long time. So I think, it's maybe necessary to step back and have some perspective about what is going on. So we're certainly seeing the emergence of new trends, new fractures, more competition, more protectionism, but elements of the old order will remain in place. And that's always the way it is in the present and the future. We always have a mix of the old and the new. Just quickly about, the risks, the kind of big risks on the horizon this year. Obviously, Trump's trying to get a quick ceasefire deal in Ukraine. It's possible that he's going to succeed in doing that. I don't think we're going to end up with any kind of substantive long-term settlement there. There's going to be a contested border, a claim, obviously, there for sovereignty by Ukraine. This is a conflict that's not susceptible to some easy resolution, but there's a possibility that we might see an end to this war that's gone on for 3 years at great cost, obviously, first and foremost for Ukraine. But there's also a risk that everything could break down and it could carry on, I would say, quite a significant risk as well. And then we have the risk of war in or more regional instability in the Middle East, and we've seen what happened overnight as well in Gaza with the Israeli strikes. So the risk there, I think, again, a very fragile ceasefire. It's kind of not a ceasefire anymore, and the risk of that breaking down is quite high. We don't know what Iran's response is going to be. And Israel obviously has an incentive to extend its recent strategic gains. Geopolitics is driving changes in the global economy too. So this intensified competition over semiconductors, over critical minerals, the race, over AI, even traditional, manufacturing industries also changing or under pressure to change. What we're seeing everywhere, which I think is a kind of partner of the kind of rise in protectionism, we're seeing the return of industrial policy, which obviously offers opportunities for businesses. But it also, I think, has a number of downsides, and maybe we can discuss some of those today. It is costly for governments and consumers. It carries risks, especially on the fiscal front, which we can also talk about. So it's a much more challenging international environment for businesses to navigate and in which to operate. Just a little bit about politics, not geopolitics, but more kind of national focus politics. What we saw last year was this huge anti-incumbent backlash. I mean, that was the biggest election year ever since in the history of the franchise. And the decisive trend really was this, as I say, backlash against incumbents everywhere, including in the advanced democracies. But everywhere, in every single region, essentially that's what we're seeing. And that is the consequence of a long-term trend of rising public dissatisfaction with political systems and with governments not delivering. So that was reflected in the elections, and it's also been reflected over many, many years in all the kind of main surveys, well-valued surveys, the Gallup polls and Pew and everything else. And that obviously is something that has driven the emergence of populist or movements, insurgent movements, which are essentially seeking to displace the mainstream political parties that have ruled the world since 1945. And I think that we're going to see a continuation of that trend, with mainstream political parties being under a lot of pressure. In elections, we're going to see, bigger votes for the insurgent parties. We just had the election in Germany, and we saw what happened there. And I think the implication of this is that unless the mainstream political parties, the parties that have ruled our world for the past 70 years or so, unless they start to reconnect with voters and start to address their concerns and start to be more representative and accountable, they will be pushed aside by these insurgent parties. And I think that is the future. So there's a lot at stake, I think, for the governing parties, ruling parties, in the next few years. Again, what we're seeing is that policy making shifting in a more kind of insular, inward-looking direction, more competition here is driving this kind of return to a national support for national champions, but it's also, I think, creating a lot of headwinds, especially on the kind of climate change front. So there's headwinds in terms of funding, obviously political headwinds as well. And there's quite a pushback, obviously in the US, but in Europe too, against some of the policies that have been pursued. So more insularity in national policy making as well. Just quickly to look at the growth outlook. So you can see here the kind of overall forecast from EIU for global growth. So looking at global growth of 2.6% in 2025, essentially the same as 2024. Possibly an improving outlook for the Middle East, but that's subject to great risk, I would say, but also in Africa. Both of those are based on the assumption that conflict is going to be alleviated to some degree. That's driving growth. We're seeing what we're forecasting as a slowdown in the US, but the US economy still being pretty robust and outperforming certainly Europe. Growth in Europe remaining tepid, and in China too, and emerging markets performing a bit better. And the medium-term outlook is, I think, very uncertain and cloudy, but looking at growth of about 2.7% per year on average. So that's, pretty lackluster by historical standards. This is another chart which, showing you essentially the orange or red colors are the countries that are growing at faster rates. So there's not many of them, unfortunately, there on this map. The dark blue are the ones that are the slowest growing economies. So not a great picture for the global growth outlook. Inflation, don't want to say too much about that because I think it's pretty clear the direction in which things are going. Inflation is moving closer to target. Central banks are cutting interest rates, but obviously inflation in terms of levels is going to remain for some time above the pre-pandemic levels. And just in terms of oil prices, geopolitical risk is obviously keeping a floor under oil prices in the next year or two. I just mentioned about the fiscal outlook. What we're seeing on the political front and the geopolitical front is essentially demands for more spending all the time by governments which are already in many places running large deficits and have large public debts. In absolute terms and as a percentage of GDP, and the demands that are now being made are, for more spending, and that is going to drive volatility in bond markets. So I think governments are going to be under pressure to either to make cuts or to find some revenue boosting measures to compensate. Otherwise, they could really be exposed to some of the volatility that we've seen over the past few months. And finally, just on the geopolitical consequences of Donald Trump's America First policy is obviously that we're seeing growing downside risk to the global trade outlook. We don't think that the kind of maximalist tariffs that were talked about in the run-up to the election or even subsequently are going to actually be carried out. But nevertheless, it's creating a lot of uncertainty everywhere and a lot of tit-for-tat, I think, actions is what we're going to see. There's a question about how countries or regions or should respond to this. I don't think necessarily that there should be tit-for-tat responses, but that's a matter obviously for governments and for the EU, but there might be a case for not retaliating in that way. Something to discuss, perhaps. I mean, in the short term, we're seeing a kind of bump up in trade in advance of the expected imposition of tariffs. And obviously we're going to see an intensification of the US-China competition, trade war, and so on. So a lot of uncertainty all around, I think. And I'm going to end